This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Rebecca Smith Aldridge. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System, and you're here tonight for the Advanced Trustee Education webinar on Pathways to Sustainable Funding. When we did our plan of service focus groups last year with member library directors and our staff, the number one issue or the number one challenge facing our member libraries was sustainable funding. Both feeling like libraries were behind on growing their funding, as well as trying to keep up with understanding the various challenges that were producing even larger gaps for funding for libraries. So tonight, we're going to address some of these issues, or at least create a strategic path for people to think about how to perhaps create a different future for our libraries in the current trajectory that we're on. But first, a few housekeeping things to make sure you have a good experience tonight. I think many of you have been with us before since this is the advanced session, but if not, you want to take a moment and locate the chat box. You should see a little word bubble icon that you can click on, and it should open up the chat box. You can send a message or a question to the entire group, or just to Kirsten or to myself. But just to practice this, why don't we go ahead and everyone find the chat box and type in your name, your library, and how long you've served on the board, just so you can exercise that muscle of using that feature of the software. Oh, hi, Meg. All right, good. It looks like people are finding that pretty easily. We've got some pros on the line with us tonight, so I'm not too worried about you folks. So the other thing I'll just mention, again, you're pretty experienced of attendees of Mid-Hudson Library System Trustee Education, but just a reminder that our gift to you is if you would like a print copy of the trustee handbook, you'll get that as a complimentary I guess, parting gift from today's webinar. So there's a little email workshop code there to use, and you'll just be emailing Alexa Stroh on our staff, and then we'll make sure that goes in the delivery to your attention to your library. We know lots of folks, obviously you can get the trustee handbook for free online. Many folks like to read it in print. I happen to be one of them. So in case that's attractive to you, with our compliments, please go ahead and request that. You'll get this code in the follow-up email after the webinar, so don't feel like you have to frantically write down anything right now. So here's our goal for tonight. We are going to take a look at what we mean by the phrase sustainable funding and really help you think about how you assess your needs, especially in the face of the trends that are impacting library services today, from everything from staffing to digital issues and facility issues. There's just a lot to consider as you craft budgets and strategic financial plans for your library, which is something that some of you may have experience with in your personal or professional life. Others of us come to this work and it may be the first time we're confronted with some of these thinking patterns that are necessary to make sure our libraries are sustainable for the future. And then we're going to take a look at a tool called multi-year financial planning, which is exactly what it sounds like. And then we're going to see a new resource that's available from the state library called the Public Library District Toolkit. Some of you may be familiar with it, but we are refreshing everyone's understanding of it in light of some things that we see coming at the state level and possibly the national level that we think may make you as a trustee want to revisit your options when it comes to how to best fund and govern your library. So I promise to make it as painless as possible. It's not necessarily the most fun topic that we've ever done here at the Mid-Hudson Library System, but it's certainly a necessary one when we think about all the good work our libraries are doing and the need to sustain that good work and make sure our staff are supported in doing that work and handing off an institution that's in better shape than when you arrived, I'm sure is most people's goal when you get onto a library board. I know that's my goal when I serve on a board. So let's just dive right in. Just again, anytime you got a question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat box. I'll also be pausing at 3 different points during the webinar to ask questions if you want to unmute yourself and ask those questions. Okay. All right, here we go. So sustainable funding, as some of you have heard us talk in the Trustee Essentials workshop, we're really talking about secure and stable funding. So there's very few libraries left in our system, luckily, who leave their funding to chance. Most libraries in the system have had at least one public vote on their budget, which means that amount of money is guaranteed every year. And you need that stability to plan for the future. However, part of our struggles in the Mid-Hudson Library System is over half of our libraries have irregular votes on their budget, which means they may go many years between votes, which just exacerbates some chronic underfunding issues that they have. So this also should probably say routine secure, stable funding. That's keeping up with demand and keeping up with inflation, and that's probably a phrase you're sick of hearing this year, but it's certainly something to consider on a regular basis, even not in extraordinary times as we live in today. But it has to be combined with the idea that we meet community needs, not just that there is cash in hand, but it's enough to meet the community's needs. So many of you came to our Trustee Essentials workshop and our other workshops. Some of you on the line tonight have even participated in our deep dive in strategic planning called Turning Outward, to truly get out there and talk to your community and find out what they need to ensure you're creating services and programs that are actually relevant and responsive to the people that we serve. So the combination of these two things is truly the definition of sustainable funding, that you have a routine and regular source of funding, it's stabilized through a public vote, and that you've done some strategic thinking about how much you actually need. A lot of times when I come to consult at your libraries, we talk about how much you can actually get away with, right, when you pass a budget vote, because a lot of our libraries are out of practice of asking taxpayers for tax support for their libraries. So a lot of times it comes down to the number itself, how palatable it might be to the voters in that particular year. However, that ignores the idea that we need to be strategic in thinking about how much money it actually takes to run a healthy library that meets the needs of our communities. So we want to step out of that campaign mindset for winning your votes and really think long-term strategically about how, yes, you're going to win your votes long-term, but also in a way that grows the library budget to be realistic. And I think a lot of our libraries are operating on budgets that are kind of shoestring, and we find a lot of workarounds, and our staff are really devoted and they are really running themselves ragged to get things done, as are many trustees. So I think we want to find better balance in how we are funding our libraries and carrying out the work that's so critical to our communities. It's stuff we just don't want to leave to chance. So public vote is part of that, but so is strategic thinking about planning, which is why we're all here this evening. So those of you who have already committed the handbook for trustees to memory know this quote, right? The best budgets are developed in relationship to the library's long-range plan, strategic planning process, and include projections for future years. And I think libraries in our system have done a great job of improving how they do long-range planning and strategic planning. We've seen over half the libraries in the system use the turning outward approach to make sure they're creating community-based plans, which is what the state now requires you to do, but it's also the right thing to do because it works really well. But less and less do we see libraries that actually do projections of how much money they're going to need in the future. And we see a lot of 12-month planning, so 1 year to the next, we see that absolutely. But libraries that are looking 3 to 5 years out of what their needs will be is not something that I think happens in a formal way. I think we have a lot of gut instinct going on in our libraries, whether it be administration or boards, who kind of think they know where it's going, and I think maybe we can get there, but sometimes their projections are off, or the person who has the best gut instinct perhaps is not making decisions about how the library is run or how much money is being asked for from the taxpayers. And that can quickly result in libraries falling behind in funding needs. So we want to just be more strategic about this moving forward, which is really a big part of why we're doing this webinar today. So I think of this all the time when we talk about this topic, this idea of mind the gap, that there's a growing gap between how much money you have coming into the organization and how much you need to meet the needs of the community. And if you're not careful, that gap can just grow to a very unhealthy distance, I guess we could say, to really compromises your ability to run your organization. And we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. I don't want to bum everybody out. We want to be positive and hopeful about the future, but we do have to confront the realities of situations that many of us have inherited when we've become involved in our libraries. And when I say the gap, what I'm talking about is, as you do your planning and you start seeing the needs in the community and you're recognizing where the pain points are in the organization and recognizing, well, more money is needed here, and this is changing a great deal when it comes to technology, and well, our community really wants us to go over here, but we don't quite have staffing that could get us there. And you think about that difference between where you are today and where you want to go or need to go as a library, and that's your gap. It's a fairly simple concept, actually, right? But it's a very holistic concept that sometimes we only look line by line in our budgets at where those pain points are, but getting a holistic view of it is really healthy, because sometimes you can see money that can be moved. Sometimes it's not new resources. Sometimes it's reallocating or reprioritizing where resources are being spent. But I think you need a realistic view of what the gap is. So you can do financial planning when it comes to asking the taxpayers for more. So you're reasonable in those asks. We have to have respect for our taxpayers. So when I first put this simple, I tried to make it a very simple slide, I realized it gets complicated immediately because it's not like you've necessarily living in a library that already is well funded. Most libraries say they need more money, or they're not quite sure where they're going to get enough money to make it through the year in some cases. So let's put this formula in parentheses and then multiply it by an exponential factor called chronic underfunding, which is what many of you have stepped into as trustees. We've inherited a library from a previous board or cast of characters over decades of helping keep your library going, who have done their best. They did their best in the circumstances they were handed. Some of them were handed libraries that were doing fine at one point, and then things changed, or you've just been limping along for a very long time, or you've arrived at a time in history where there's just extra pressure on the finances of the library. I think that in the 20 odd years I've been working with libraries, we've just seen a phenomenal amount of factors influence library finances. And it's just, I think, increasing almost every year where the pressure points are. So even if you walked into a library that's running really well, it's important to stay on top of that, if not ahead of it, to make sure you're future-proofing the library against disruption and the unexpected, those things that are coming our way that we don't see, we might not understand, or we might not have our eye on the correct kind of end of the horizon of what's happening. As we think about how technology has influenced our business, how facility needs are impacting our business, how climate change is impacting our business, all of these things can put extra pressures even on the best funded libraries and the most strategic libraries in the world. So we just want to kind of identify some of those signs of chronic underfunding. It's kind of like, you know it when you see it. We want to unpack some of those things for you, because this should be part of the thinking as you're becoming more strategic about financial planning for the library and moving forward. Now, for most libraries, the largest budget line is your personnel line. And sometimes we just look at the bottom line of the personnel line. We're like, oof, that's the largest percentage of the budget. That's a lot of money. But actually, sometimes we need to dig a little deeper into the numbers that make up the bottom line to make sure we truly understand them. And one of the primary, I would say, almost first signifiers of a library that's struggling is when you have high staff turnover, when you find yourself as a board having to hire a director every few years, or your director is kind of losing time on the administrative end because they constantly have to fill positions. You're not seeing a high level of retention of your staff. And that's something that's been talked about across the nation in the face of the pandemic. I think many of us have heard the phrase, the great resignation, right? That's not libraries are not unaffected by that as well, but it's something that has been an issue in libraries for much longer than just the past 2 years. And so there's a couple of things I want to put in front of you to have you consider thinking about as you consider the future of your library, what kind of values you're living as a library, and where you're investing funds on behalf of the community through the library's budget. So we subscribe to the idea that minimum wage might not be a living wage for people in our communities. And the difference there is minimum wage is a number that's set by government. State and federal government sets what a minimum wage legally must be. And many organizations take that as the bottom floor of the entry point to work for an organization. However, it doesn't take into account what it actually costs to live in a community. So MIT has created something called the Living Wage Calculator that takes a look at the actual economics of a community, our county. They'll go up to the county level at least, and take a look at what does it actually take to live in this community and have shelter and food and transportation, just the realities of living, right? So when we take a look at the living wage that's predicted for the 5 counties in our service area, we can see none of our 5 counties in our libraries are hitting the living wage averages. So when we think about staff who have options, there are lots of options in the job market today. While they may have a great affection for the library and the work that we do in libraries, that comes up against the reality of living, of having a family, of wanting to have a good quality of life. So as we think about how to structure funding for staff positions in the future, this might be a factor that we throw into the mix. that we want to retain the quality staff. Our directors work so hard to recruit. It takes a lot of time and energy to recruit people, to train them. And when you've got a great person, you want to keep them, as you know, folks who are running libraries that have great directors. So when we think about minimum wage versus living wage, if you're not familiar with the phrase living wage, this is something that Kirsten just stuck into the chat box for you. You can check out the calculator and you can see it. It comes in a variety of different perspectives. It's one person by themselves. It's perhaps two people who have children. What does it look like to actually earn money to live in the community that you're serving? And so we think about living our values out loud. We don't want to underfund our staff to a degree that they leave, or they're resentful, or we're asking them to do a little too much on behalf of the community for not enough pay. So I wanted to point out a real standout library. It's actually not in our state, but they won the very first citation for wellness at the American Library Association. And they did so not for what anyone expected. We thought we would see staff wellness programs that were focused on health. But the very first winner of this award was focused on pay equity and using the living wage structure to completely change what it looked like to work at the library. So everyone's pay was adjusted using the living wage as the base salary in the organization. And then folks who'd been there longer, have more job responsibilities, were adjusted accordingly. And so this library has more sustainability and resilience because they're not going to be rocked every time minimum wage changes, but they're also showing great respect for the staff and acknowledging that they're valued members of the institution. And honestly, without their help, the institution isn't much of anything, to be honest. So really showing that respect for the staff is why they won that national award. So the story of this library is something we're going to share with you tonight as well, if you want to learn more about what they did and how they did it. It's a really good exemplar that we hope more libraries follow their lead. So we talked about entry-level positions in your organization, but even more disruptive to you as the board is the director's position. And if you have high turnover in the director's position, you know it's very hard to accomplish things in your long-range plan without that daily leadership from the director. Now, for many years, Kirsten and I have worked on the newsletter of the Mid-Hudson Library System. And when I came here in 1998, I inherited a little blurb that was supposed to be in every single bulletin. And it talked about the need for the starting salary of a librarian in your organization with a master's in library science degree to make the equivalent of a teacher in your community. And when we think about that, you're like, well, you know, a teacher, very, very important person in our community and doing excellent work educating the young minds of our communities. They're in charge of a classroom of children. The director is in charge of an institution. They are creating lifelong learning experiences for folks of all ages in our community. They're running a building, they're running the board, they're helping to do the financial planning we're talking about here tonight. Much more responsibility overall in that position. But what we've seen over time is a lack of investment in director salaries, which is causing higher and higher turnover in our libraries in the Mid-Hudson Library System. We've seen record numbers of director turnover every year for the past 5 years. So that's not a record I was looking forward to seeing our libraries break, but they've managed to do it. And so I'm bringing this to your attention today to help you think about how to advocate for your directors and what they're making. We pulled the average salaries of directors and teachers in each of the 5 counties in our system, and the disparity is pretty noticeable between those two roles. So as we think about how we value the work of a director as well, we have to start thinking, what's the competition for these positions? Not only are they competing with other libraries that might be nearby, geographically nearby your library, the director might be scanning when there's a job opening and saying, wow, that library over there pays a lot more. They have bills to pay as well. They have careers to think about as well. But what we're also seeing is folks no longer thinking my only option is a library director position. We have a phrase that makes me smile every time I hear it, which is library adjacent work. We're seeing library directors step out of being a director because they can make more money doing something else. They could become a teacher themselves. They're not that far away from getting their teacher certificate. They could be working in a for-profit area. They could be taking on the administration of a different type of nonprofit. So as we think about the competition in the field, we really want to make sure we're retaining excellent directors in our member libraries. As you know, as trustees, this makes or breaks your experience as a library board member, having a great director who understands the lay of the land and is a partner with you in leading the library forward. So hopefully this is eye-opening to you. Your library may be on the higher end of the average, and maybe this isn't as large a disparity. But if you're struggling with keeping directors, or you know your director is looking to go someplace else, I think it's a good idea to benchmark the salary that you're offering against what the competition is in your community or in your county, to understand there's options out there more than there ever were before. The pandemic has skyrocketed the number of work from home options that broadens the opportunities for folks in the professional vein to find other options besides working at the library. So it's a sad thing for me to say, because I love libraries, as do you, and we want folks to feel appreciated at our libraries. But these gaps are just growing in our communities, and it's something that needs more attention, or we're going to see more disruption to the administration of our libraries in the Hudson Valley. The other big item that we see a deficit in many libraries in our system is that of the benefits they're offering. Just this week, I was asked by the New York Library Association to do a survey of the association libraries in our system. That makes up about half the libraries in our system, to report on their retirement benefits for a bill that we're working to pass in the New York State Legislature over the next session. The bill would allow for association libraries to join the state retirement system, which is a major door opener that would obviously help you with recruitment if you had access to that program. And I can't say that I was shocked when I finally pulled the number, but 90% of association libraries are not providing retirement benefits for their directors. I'm not even talking about the rest of the staff, just the directors. So again, when we talk about being competitive, about retaining great staff, we have to think about salary and benefits. And if it's something that the mantra on the board has been, oh, well, that's too expensive, I think it's time just to get a reality check. Let's find out how much it would cost. It doesn't mean you have to do it right away, but let's at least get real numbers for these things and not just go on the mythology of folks that looked into it maybe a decade ago. There's lots of new options out there to create attractive benefits packages for your folks. And I think some energy and effort in that area can go a long way with staff who are very devoted to your organizations and really are possibly doing that work at a loss sometimes for themselves. So a good benefits package is going to be a solid way to make sure you're retaining good staff and able to recruit new staff. Some of you have directors who have been there for a very long time, and it's a hard thing to think about, but someday they will retire. And when they retire, are you going to have the capacity financially to attract a new director into your organization that's going to provide the same wonderful service for your community? So sometimes it's not about the person in the position today, but how you're going to recruit into that position in the future years. So I'm certainly not saying that you shouldn't be thinking about it for the person in the seat, but sometimes that calculus there needs to be about the projections for the future, because we're not going to have the ability to do an all or nothing situation. Part of what I want to talk to you about tonight is incremental growth. That sometimes we'll find there's big gaps. It doesn't mean we're going to find all of that money within the next 12 months. We're going to have to think very strategically about how to grow the budget in the right direction to achieve financial goals that you identify for yourself. The other thing we've been talking a lot about here, and I just want to give a shout out. Many of you know Casey Conlon, who is our library sustainability coordinator, who has left us to go work in another organization. And he did some excellent research on the high cost of turnover. So when someone leaves their position and now your director needs to hire someone new, it's not just about their time, there's also money involved in that work. The industry estimates for nonprofits are 20 to 30% of the cost of that position are being invested when you have turnover in a position. It's actually a very expensive proposition when you have high turnover in your organization. So obviously smaller libraries, this hurts more when you have key people who there's no backup for them. And you think about your director now trying to cover all of those positions that they might be trying to fill. But it's not just the financial hit that your organization takes, there's also a morale hit that your staff is experiencing when that happens. It can make people think, well, what's wrong with our organization? Why aren't people staying here? Or making them look a little closer at, you know, it isn't really ideal here financially for me. Maybe I should be looking too. And you can't protect against that 100% of the time, but I think it is important to put a good faith effort into thinking about those situations if you find yourself in them when you're seeing high turnover of staff in the organization. I actually, on my break here today, I was just flipping through the newest issue of American Libraries magazine from the American Library Association, and this was one of the headline articles on the cover page, the cover of American Libraries this month, called Quitting Time, talking about how the Great Resignation is affecting libraries across the country. And obviously these are all the same things we're hearing about in other industries, whether it's people who are just burnt out from working with the public, frustration with administration, low pay and low morale. But I think burnout has become such a big issue during the pandemic for our staff. They went through extreme stress trying to meet the needs of the community at a really dangerous period of time in 2020, when they're trying to keep themselves safe, their families safe, as well as the community safe. And recognizing that they were just becoming exhausted doing the work may have made them reevaluate their priorities in light of how much they're paid for that work, or what the commitment from the board or the administration is to them in that institution. So interesting article if you want to kind of get a feel for what it looks like across the industry in the country today. But the Mid-Hudson Library System member libraries are not immune to this. This is happening in our region as well. So it's a very big issue that I think there is some cause for concern there, and definitely worth a committee meeting or two to really analyze your pay scales, your benefits options, and making sure you've got really solid information to base decisions on for the future. The second massive area of budgets is related to your facilities. Almost all of our member libraries own their own buildings, which means you are the stewards of those buildings. And just like those of you who own your own homes know, there's a almost never-ending list of things that you have to invest money in when it comes to your house. And so facility stewardship issues, when we start to see libraries that can't keep the doors to the library open because of the need for frequent repairs or failing infrastructure. We've seen libraries have to close because they can't keep the building cool during the summer or warm during the winter. We've got libraries that have had floods because the plumbing or the infrastructure in the building related to the municipality is just worn down and older. So there's always need for upkeep, of course. And then there's the grander plans we have for our buildings. Many of our libraries are in buildings that were never meant to be libraries. They might have been former homes or different types of facilities. And so sometimes they're not ideal for the types of services that we need to deliver in the year 2022. So lots of libraries have master plans for their facility to renovate, to make more accessible, to expand those buildings. And all of those things take multi-year planning and annual attention to make sure we're keeping up with what we already have, as well as planning for what would be ideal for the community when it comes to the facility. And so I just wanted to share two numbers with you that I find very interesting, because I think it's a very good indicator of the need to do more planning when it comes to facility financing. In the Mid-Hudson Library System, our member library directors have reported over $44 million in need for construction. So those are just for the renovation, expansion projects, perhaps smaller projects like accessibility or energy efficiency, but $44 million worth of need. That is not insignificant. But when I look at the numbers of the capital reserves of the member libraries, and capital reserves are allowable by your library. These are things, this is money that you use for larger maintenance projects at your library, as well as large projects related to renovation and expansion. You can see that there's just about $7.4 million in savings, shall we say, towards capital needs. And that does not address the everyday things that need to get done and maintained in our library. So it's an area I always keep my eye on, and I try to talk up all the time the need to build up our capital funds at our libraries to not only future-proof your facility issues, to make sure you've got funding to deal with the things that are just wear and tear on the building that need to be kept up, but also hoping our libraries can grow and modernize buildings to keep up with what folks are needing in our communities. So if you're not familiar with this resource from Hudson, I just wanted to share it with you here tonight. We have just a really simple facility plan outline to start capturing some of the needs, whether it be just routine maintenance, preventative maintenance work that should be happening in the organization. If you have a building that's not fully accessible, how you're going to be addressing that. If you are leaking money literally out the windows and doors and you want to tighten up the building envelope for energy conservation needs, just a place to capture all that thinking in one document. So I just wanted to point out this resource, and Kirsten just put a link to the Word document in the chat box if you wanted to save that for your facilities committee meeting. But it's a great way to get a handle on the needs, the everyday needs of your library, as well as starting to project out further for bigger needs or renovation goals that you may have for the library. And once you've done that assessment, then you can start doing the financial planning for it. You know, how you're going to roll into a capital line that you see every year in your annual budget that can keep up with just the routine stuff, the useful end of useful life maintenance or preventative maintenance that we're talking about here on page 1, and as well as to address some of the larger projects that you may identify through this process. And then, of course, making sure you're putting some money in capital reserve every year and growing that amount. We've seen libraries be very, very smart about this. The Volusia Library in Columbia County, they were just like squirrels, right? They just squirreled money, a little bit of money every year away. And when the time was right, they were able to purchase a new building out of that capital fund because they'd been so smart about it over the years. So a little bit every year can go a long way over time. But if you haven't projected those needs far enough out, the bill can come due a little quicker than your capital fund can bear. And that's not a comfortable position to find yourselves in. That doesn't address, you know, long-term massive projects that I know are on some people's horizons for very big renovation and expansion projects. That's a whole nother webinar for us today. We just want to make sure people are keeping up with the stewardship of their existing buildings and getting accessibility and energy conservation issues addressed in a timely manner. So if you're not familiar with reserve funds, and we find there are definitely some libraries in our system that are kind of like surprised. Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know we could have a fund where we put money aside for certain things. We have libraries that are like spending down their budget every year, which is a very scary proposition. So if you're not familiar with this publication from the Office of the State Comptroller, Kirsten just put the link to it in the chat box. It's super accessible. I don't want you to be intimidated by it at all. I could understand it. You could understand it. It outlines the type of reserve funds that are allowable, particularly for public libraries and association libraries. While you don't fall under the auspices of the Office of the State Comptroller, it's excellent advice for an organization that receives as much public money as you do. Highly recommend association libraries follow these rules as well. But you can see what are allowable things to save money for. Obviously, you might have cash flow issues from the start of your fiscal year to when tax money arrives, and it's perfectly acceptable to be having cash flow reserves so that you can meet the needs in the interim. Capital reserves are allowable, as are some undesignated funds for those kind of surprises that happen to our organization sometime. And one that you may not be familiar with that actually the Mid-Hudson Library System just made use of, but an employee benefit accrued liability reserve fund. I don't know if you've ever had this situation at your library. We've certainly had it here at Mid-Hudson. When a long-term employee retires or departs from the organization and has quite the stockpile of time off we have to pay them for, and maybe you didn't budget for that this year, this would allow you to put money aside to make sure you can cover those liabilities and obligations to that employee without compromising the budget that you've set forth for the year to deliver services to the community. So I highly recommend this publication. It's very accessible, as I said, and might help you think differently about financial planning in the future. So the next, I think, let's see, sign that you might be chronically underfunded. And I know there's people on this call tonight that this applies to. And I just want to say before I flip to the next slide, this is not a judgment. This is just a signal that you might be underfunded as a library if this is an issue. And this is when the trustees are carrying out roles that paid staff normally do in other libraries. And the smaller the library, the more likely this is going to be. And it's really like how small libraries make it, which is admirable in our system. And it's something I really, high five or give a, healthy elbow to somebody anymore when you see how much work trustees do in this area. It's so amazing. But at the end of the day, if a particular trustee with a particular skill set goes away and something that's mission critical is not getting done or you don't have capacity to do it, it compromises the operation of the library. And I use my own father as an example in this one. Many of you know my dad was a trustee at one of our member libraries for many years before I became an employee here at Mid-Hudson. But he used to shovel the sidewalk and plow the driveway. And he was happy to do it. He loved getting out there in the storms and he enjoyed the exercise and he didn't mind it at all. But when he came off the board and the bill came due to hire someone to do that, it was sticker shock for the library board. So at the very least, you'll want to estimate how much it would cost if there was a paid person, vendor, contractor doing work that sometimes trustees are covering. Because someday the situation may arise in that you do have to pay out for that service. And building that money over time into the budget is a really smart way to close that gap and help a trustee who may have been giving a lot of their time and energy to the organization the permission to step down when it's right for them. I can't tell you how many trustees I've had a conversation with who are just really tired. They've done their job. They've been there for over a decade and they're really tired, but they're scared to step away because they don't see anyone else to do that work, or they don't see money in the budget to help cover that work. So to future-proof the library over time, you'll want to build in that money. And that's not that we're not appreciative of trustees that are doing that work. It's just facing the reality of what it actually costs to run that organization. You'll want to do the same thing if you have arrangements with your town. If your town has been providing in-kind services to the library, whether you're a municipal library or not, they may be plowing your snow or cutting the grass or coming over to fix stuff at the library. Their financial situation can change as well, and they may not have the capacity to continue to help you out in that very generous way in the future. So you'll really want to think through, well, how much would it cost if we did have to hire someone to do that work, and can we build that into the budget over time so it's not devastating when that happens? We've seen it happen to libraries over the years where the plug just gets pulled, and all of a sudden the library board's like, oh, how are we going to pay for that? And so we do estimate, the in-kind value, what it would cost in the open market to have those same services. And it's not, again, not disingenuous to do that work. It's really how you stay on top of it and make sure the library is secure in future years. So the thing that you probably thought I was going to say during this segment was talking about a library that struggles to meet the community needs, which is tied to all of the things we're talking here tonight. At the end of the day, right, that's why we're all here. We're trying to provide quality library service that meets the needs of the community. And so there's little things you can keep your eye on that when you see them happening, you realize you're not keeping up with demand, that folks are not getting access to services in a timely manner or in a way that's respectful of them in the community. There could be things as simple as you don't have enough capacity for folks in your programs. There's always a waiting list for summer reading programs or early literacy programs or even your adult programs. Or you might see really long wait times in the online catalog. Our online catalog is structured in such a way that if you own it, your people get it first. But if you're hearing people say, like, I've been waiting for months for something, it may mean that you're under investing in your collections. Now, you're part of, if I do say so myself, one of the best library systems in the state. We have libraries that are willing to share at a level that you don't see in many other places, but it requires everyone to be a good neighbor. We all have to invest in our print collections and our digital collections. We can't expect other libraries to foot the bill for our patrons. So making sure your library is doing its fair share to not only meet the needs of your community, but to reciprocate when other libraries help your folks get stuff, you want to make sure you're helping them do that as well. It's not a strategy to use the backs of other libraries, taxpayers, to make sure your patrons are getting what they want. We save millions of dollars by doing this work, but trust can be eroded if libraries are not contributing in an equitable way. So something to take a look at, and we're actually having a very big effort on this front this year when it comes to digital collections. The Directors Association has convened an ad hoc committee to take a look at Overdrive Investments. It's an area that we're seeing underinvestment in by an actual majority of our libraries in the Mid-Hudson library system. And it's not because folks are trying to get out of paying for it. It's because it's still considered a newer medium that's challenging to underwrite given how publishers are licensing material. And it makes it a guessing game sometimes of how to do it well. So we're going to make a study of it and give library directors more information to make better decisions with the limited funds that we have available to do this work. But if we're going to be in the business of helping people connect with print and digital materials, we need to do it well. And while we may have mastered the print material side of the business, the digital side of the business is something that's evolving and needs more attention. But what we're learning is that it's not supplanting money from your print budget into your digital budget. It's really requiring a new investment of money, unfortunately, to meet the needs that are out there in these areas. So an area of growth for sure. When we take a look at what people are asking of from libraries, there's two major growth areas: programming for all ages is something people are clamoring for, and digital collections. People love the convenience of what they can get through Libby, which is the Overdrive mobile app for ebooks and downloadable audiobooks. We saw a 40% increase during the pandemic. When people couldn't get through the doors of your libraries, they went through the digital door to access your services. But once they could come back in your door, they realized they really loved those digital services. So we have not seen demand in that area wane as we've really ramped up in-person services again. So that's here to stay, which is going to take some thinking for how to keep up with that really big increase in demand. So let's see, we've got, the next thing we're going to talk about is broadband connectivity. And this is something that there's a lot of money coming from the federal and state government for right now. And so we've made a study of this here at the Mid-Hudson Library System. It's been something that we've been able to attract funding for in our own system, and your libraries can as well. But it's shocking, right, to think about this, that almost 120,000 kids in the Hudson Valley don't have access to the internet at home. And so that does not even speak about the number of adults that probably don't have it, or families that only have a mobile device to do the work that they need to do online anymore, which is something I think most of us recognize you can't quite get by without access to the internet anymore, whether it's for banking or downloading government forms or getting information or fact checking things. The internet's pretty critical, and it's critical to student success. And libraries are the #1 point of access for folks who don't have it at home. But shockingly, in our member libraries, 83% of member libraries do not have the broadband connectivity that's recommended for modern library service. So you can see the numbers, and if you're not techie, we can explain those for you. But at the bottom, you can see the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the American Library Association actually agree on something. They agree on the speeds that public libraries should have to not only keep up with patron demand, but just the general library infrastructure of running a modern library. You're all running software that requires connections to the internet to run the front desk, as well as bookkeeping software and other critical software that keeps your library running. So as we think about those two needs, you have a lot of demand for broadband connectivity in that library building. So when we take a look at what's it going to take to be a viable library in the future, this is an additional area of investment. We just had a workshop this week for directors called Toward Gigabit Libraries, which is a new tool available to libraries for free to take a look at your internal connectivity networks, and also to figure out how to increase your broadband speeds over time. So it even helps the non-techie people in libraries, of which there are many, to become knowledgeable about the library's technology and understand where the opportunities for improvement are. Sometimes it's a low-cost improvement that can make a massive difference to the working conditions of staff who are using the Sierra software every day, or the broadband needs of patrons who are relying on you for their internet connectivity. So we're actually going to be announcing in 2023 a cohort opportunity for libraries that want to do this work, and we'll walk you through this toolkit together. But many of you have library staff who are already doing some of this work, or who are perfectly capable of doing it as well. It's a great resource, a really good example of the federal money that gets spent on projects for libraries, creating something really practical and very useful for libraries. So we also pulled some data that we get asked the question all the time: how do I increase people coming through the door? I got asked this question just this week on a consultation we were doing with a member library. And I think a lot of people think there's just some magic trick to having people come through the door at the library. If we just had a more creative program that we offered, or if we just had a few more books, or if we just had a fresh coat of paint on the library front room, all of these things, of course, add up to success. But the truth is, investment in your staff and offering of programs is one of the key indicators of what kind of door count you're going to have over time. We took a look at some national statistics, and it indicates that the libraries in the top 10 states who are having the highest door counts, it's tied to how many programs they're doing per capita. That's how they're driving more people through the door. That's how they're getting more items checked out from their library. Programs are staff intensive. You need staff time to plan them, to advertise them, to implement them, and to evaluate them. So it's no small thing. So when I started at Mid-Hudson Hudson in 1998, programming was actually just becoming like a hot thing in libraries, believe it or not. We've always had children's programs, but adult programs were increasing exponentially every year. Very quickly, we saw a 400% increase in the number of programs that were being offered in libraries and tenfold increases in the number of folks that were coming through our doors, which explained why people were so puzzled when they would say, well, isn't the internet going to replace libraries? And why are people still checking out books? Well, programming became a real major service point for libraries, but not all libraries invested in the staff or the advertising money to do it well. So when we think about where you're investing for the future, we've talked about staff recruitment and retention. It also may be about different job titles at your library. You may need to hire folks that specialize in program or specialize in marketing to help more people in your community connect with the services that you have to offer. So that's definitely a trend we're seeing in our libraries. We actually have folks that are hiring folks that specialize in social media or adult literacy, not just early literacy. So if your director is coming to you proposing, a different way to think about how we staff the library, it's for the good of connecting more folks with the services that they need. But again, it's something that no one person can do everything well, right? So if your director is wearing all those hats and planning programs and unstopping the toilet and coming to the board meeting and going out to get the word out, they're going to burn out, right? They're going to need some more help in those areas. So as we think about how we build staff for the future, that's another important conversation as we think about building budgets that are sustainable for libraries that are sustainable. So I call this the freak out section of the webinar, right? There's like so much to work on. Of course, there's a lot of work to do. Of course, absolutely. Should you panic about it? No. I mean, there might be some of you that are in situations where I could see where you might be very anxious, but I think you've just got to methodically work through it. That's why you've got other folks on the board to help you. It's why you've got a great director to help guide you on some of these bigger issues, and why you've got the system to call for help. We help a lot of libraries with issues like this all the time, but what we really are just asking is that some thought is given to this. It's not the kind of thing we can continue to sweep under the rug and think, oh, someone else will probably figure that out, or we'll leave that one for the next board, right? We've got to do a little work now to have a big impact later. And so that's kind of the overarching message here for tonight. And the next section of the webinar is going to be about multi-year financial planning, of how to take all these things you've learned about, oh, there's need here and we got to do some work here, and ooh, that number is a little bigger than we were hoping, and then thinking about how you're going to break it down and actually make it achievable. But before I move on to that section, I wanted to pause here and to see if there was any questions that folks might have or comments folks wanted to make. Kirsten, have I missed any questions in the chat box yet?
Nothing's popped up yet.
All right, just a reminder at this point, if you need to unmute to ask a question or make a comment, that's totally fine. Okay, got a quiet bunch tonight, that's all right. You can save your questions to the end. So next we're going to talk about multi-year financial planning, which, as we mentioned, we've seen lots of libraries do maybe a 1 year out, but we're asking more libraries to think about doing a 3 to 5 year projection. There's a number of numbers that you do know or that you can predict. And so instead of just kind of like hoping we make it across the finish line each year financially, let's actually plan to make it across the finish line each year financially. So the Office of the State Comptroller here in New York has some really practical, useful, accessible tools to help with this. They have another local management resource guide that we'll give you the link to in just a few minutes. But just to kind of break it down for you, what we're talking about is using long-term priorities to work towards financial goals. So we're asking that your strategic plan perhaps be aligned with financial planning as well as operational planning. And sometimes boards have a disconnect between those two things. You might see a strategic plan that is very focused on services and programs, but you don't see one that's focused on the internal needs to make those services and programs successful. And those two things have to go hand in hand when it comes to financial planning. We also want to see libraries stop spending down their reserves. We have some libraries that are very fortunate to have endowments, and many of them are very, very careful about how they withdraw money from that, so they're not damaging the principal of those endowment funds. But we also see libraries that just like whack them down till there's nothing left, and then they kind of look around and be like, oh, what are we going to do now? Right? So reserve funds are, I don't want to say a piggy bank, but they're a strategic tool to use to meet the goals of the library. So as we talked about your capital fund, right, you don't want to just spend it down. You want new money coming into that on a regular basis. So there's a balance there that helps you keep up with the demands on that capital reserve fund. And we also want to break the habit that some libraries unfortunately have of using one-time revenue sources to fill the long-term operating gaps they may find themselves with. So of course, we all are very excited when libraries get a grant, but those are usually one-time grants. They're rarely allowable for operations costs. They might be for a one-time program or a one-time enhancement to your facility or technology, but it's not necessarily going to help you with funding staff or making sure the building's maintained on a regular basis. So we want to close those gaps. So when you get those one-time funds, they accelerate strategic plans, but aren't the only way you can get mission critical stuff done. And then of course, multi-year financial planning is attractive from where I sit because I feel it's respectful to your taxpayers. When you're, we've watched a lot of association libraries over the years wait, almost a decade between votes and then go out to taxpayers and say, oh, look what a great job we did by saving money. And by the way, we need a 25% increase to your taxes for the library. And taxpayers are like, no, I don't want to pay that much all at once. So if we can be more methodical about how much the library needs and doing projections and really pacing out the increases that are necessary to ask for, I think it's much more understandable for your taxpayers. They don't see their town taxes go up wildly like that or their school taxes go up wildly like that. They really shouldn't be seeing their library taxes going up wildly like that. So if we can be more methodical and more routine votes, which we're going to talk about a little more in just a second, and doing amounts that are more palatable to our taxpayers. I think for association libraries, that's our long-term goal, is to get into patterns that are more, I think, relatable to the taxpayer. But that might take some big jumps first to get there and to get into that pattern in a really healthy way. And then I think it also helps you with your fundraising and grant seeking goals. We have a tradition in libraries of just thinking any grant is a good grant, but the truth is grants are very expensive in terms of staff time to write them, to manage a project, to report on them. And oftentimes they're grants that don't tie to the strategic goals the board has set for itself in the institution. So with multi-year planning, it forces you to say where money is necessary, which things are mission critical, which things would be nice, but hey, if it didn't happen, it's not going to compromise the strategic goals we have for the organization. And then you create kind of a bucket list of things that, shall we say, would be shovel-ready projects, where if you see a grant opportunity and you can make the match and say, ooh, that would be perfect for that thing over here we were hoping to do, but we just don't have the money for. And this is something we found many libraries caught short on during the pandemic. So of all the problems I thought we'd have during the pandemic, this was not one of them. But we had situation after situation where grant funds were available and libraries just weren't ready for them. They weren't quite sure how they would spend the money or didn't have the capacity to build a program around what money was available for. We had a situation in Dutchess County where the county used federal American Rescue Plan Act money for libraries. Each library, they earmarked $50,000. Amazing, right? It's the first time we've ever seen that kind of money from Dutchess County for public libraries. And we had libraries who left some of that money on the table. They just didn't quite know what to do with it. And so I don't think that should ever be a problem. Spending money in a library situation, you should always have ideas for where money could be invested if you had a little more. If a funder came your way or a really generous donor knocked on the door and said, hey, and this does happen, they will come to you, even legislators, hey, could you use $20,000? And if your director or the board is kind of like, I don't know, that's not the reaction your funder or your legislator is looking for, right? They want you to hear like, wow, we could really use that money. Here's why. It would make a huge difference in our early literacy program. Or, oh, wow, this would mean we could finally get that accessible entrance. Or, wow, this would mean we could overhaul our technology infrastructure. They want to hear excitement and energy towards where that money could be put to really good use. So you have to prepare for that. We have to prepare for success, basically, which is a fun thing to think about, but it has to be done in context of making sure the everyday needs of the library are met. So when we talk about a multi-year financial plan, if you're not familiar with this concept, As I noted, the guide from OSC is great. And they have the different segments of what would be in a multi-year financial plan. So a lot of what you would expect, I would imagine, revenue projections. How much money do you know is coming into the organization? And some of you have a pretty good idea. You can take a look back at historic trends and you can see whether your voters are saying yes on a regular basis or not, or you might be in a library that has uneven revenue increases, which is can be worrisome as you look to the future, but also doing expenditure projections. You have many things where you can take a look back over the past 3-4 years and calculate, wow, that goes up about X% every year. So if we project forward, that'll be another % up the next year, another % up the year after that. So you can get a pretty good idea of where a lot of the bigger things are going over the next 3 to 5 years. And then annual deficits and surpluses. If you find in the organization, and even newer trustees can recognize this, that sometimes you end up at the end of the year with a deficit, and I've been to many a board meeting where I will be looking at the financial report during the board meeting and I'll be like, whoa, this is a little intimidating, and I see a big deficit coming. They're like, yeah, but we've got this angel donor. He always comes through in November, and so we're not too worried. And that's great, but it's also kind of scary to think about what if that person decided not to give to the library, or they had a change in finances and couldn't give to the library. Same goes for surpluses though too. We have some libraries that will land with a surplus at the end of the year for a variety of reasons. Things change over the course of the year. What are you doing with that money? Is it going into capital reserves? Is it helping build the stability of the organization going forward? Or are you seeing planned surpluses that are unnecessary, which means that you're not fully investing in the everyday operation of the library, which is a funny way to think about an unhealthy practice. But it's true. Sometimes we're nervous about spending the money, so we save it, but we're starving programs, services, collections, staff to a point that's unsustainable. So that's an interesting point to look at for analysis as well. And then reserves and fund balances we talked about as well. You might have goals for fund balances. You might create a fund balance. That, of course, all fund balances and reserves need to be approved by your board, and you might create one with a goal that maybe you can't meet this year, but you're going to have a plan for how you're ultimately going to meet it. So for example, here at the Mid-Hudson Library System, we have a capital reserve fund, and it's tied to our board approved facility plan. And over time, that plan changes as we assess the building, or we understand needs in a different way, or catastrophic things go wrong, we have to adjust our thinking. But that capital reserve is tied to the planning done in that building. So the target for it may change over time, which means a restructuring or a rethinking of how we're going to fund that fund. And the last thing there is a fiscal improvement plan, which is actually just a narrative. That's not the spreadsheet end of the plan, but just a narrative of the thinking of the board of how we're going to change the situation, or how we're going to deal with the issues identified during your multi-year financial plan activity. So that might be your strategy for public votes moving forward. For association libraries, it might be, well, this indicates we're going to have to go out for a vote every 2 years in order to hit this mark if everything went ideally. Or you might be looking at a situation where you have liabilities in your budget that you can see might be coming to an end, which will free up money for something else. So you'll be explaining things in that narrative in the last part of that financial plan. So it obviously is work. I'm not saying it's not work to do, but it's something that I think really helps your library stabilize, but also be really ready for growth, as well as prepare the board for where the work is as the governing entity of the organization, of where the energy needs to go. Is the energy on financial planning right now? Maybe. Is it on passing budget votes or doing so more regularly? That could be another team that's thinking about how to help the library in the future. But I think it helps trustees feel more confident that you know what's going on, you've got the lay of the land, and even if it's challenging, even if you're intimidated by the money or the gap, and you can see you need a lot more in the next few years, if you don't acknowledge it today, it just gets worse. So there's no day like today to acknowledge reality and start thinking about the future and how to right size or course correct or find solutions in the future. And that can look different from library to library. And so for me as a library consultant, that's what's exciting about working with libraries. It's rare that two libraries have the same situation, and the problem solving involved with that you can be creative with, and the system can help you with that. From telling you stories about how other libraries have dealt with these challenges, or helping you with your budget votes, or figuring out different streams of money. There's all sorts of ways to diversify the solutions that might be in play, but there's always going to be a need to talk to the taxpayers about the needs of their library and the reality check of what it costs to actually run a library. As you know from other workshops you've been to, there's a lot of assumptions out there of what people think libraries are and how we're funded and where the money comes from. It's been years now, but I still meet people who think the books are all donated and that Bill Gates still pays for all the computers. And of course the utilities give you free internet, right? So those reality checks for people are important. That education of our public is something that is an ongoing goal that we have, of course. So there's a nice chart in the manual from the Office of State Comptroller for how to do the work. It's almost like a workbook of the steps to take to do the work, from gathering historical data, making note of some of the trends we talked about here tonight, from paying a living wage to broadband connectivity goals to where we're actually investing money when it comes to collections and programs in the future, and then deciding how far out you want to project, right? Do you want to go 3 years out, 5 years out? I don't know if you want to go much further than that, because it's hard to have a crystal ball and understand what's going to be influencing folks after that. But then describing your assumptions, things you assume. If you assume that, well, hey, every time we've gone out for a vote so far, it's passed, and as long as we keep it under, this percentage increase, good chance it's going to pass again. Those are things that can go into your thinking about how you can solve some of the gaps that you identify during the process. And then lastly, just selecting the level of detail you want to operate in. We see library boards I'm going to say not library boards, but library directors that go like a little too far on the detail, where they're down to looking at like program supplies. What do we think about popsicle sticks 5 years from now? Is that going to go up? How much is that going to go up? That's probably not the detail we want people working at, right? We want to be thinking about our revenues, our major categorical expenditures, from personnel to facility upkeep, not necessarily the very specific elements under that. But again, we want something that is realistic, but not overwhelming as you try to calculate what possible increases on certain things will be. So that's my little reminder here for you, is just don't sweat the small stuff. And I know some people will say, well, it's all small stuff. But the truth is there's, those budget categories in your financial reports. And so maybe at the line item level, perhaps, but it might be one level up that you're doing these projections at, so it's not so overwhelming. So let's say you did this work. Let's say you created a multi-year financial plan. Yay, you. So now what? That's what we're going to talk about in the last third of the webinar here this evening. But before we do so, I just want to pause and see if we've got any questions or comments that would be useful to the group here tonight.
This is Meg. I have a question.
Hi, Meg. How are you?
Good. Kristen has been putting the links in the chat, but can you also email those to us?
Yes, absolutely. You'll get a follow-up email after the webinar that has the PDF of the slides, all the links that we shared, and even a link to a recording of the webinar.
Very good. Thank you.
Sure. I see a question that's coming in here. So Mark, I just want to tell you, I'm going to get to that. All right, just remember, you're welcome to unmute if that's easier for you to ask a question. All right, well, at least I know Mark and Meg are awake, so I'm going to keep going, all right? So this last section of achieving sustainable funding, many of you have worked with me in the past on your votes at your library and know that this is the #1 way to stabilize your library and grow it for the future. And when we think about the percentages that we ask for sometimes through our votes, the public libraries on the call, the school district public libraries, and the special district public libraries, you are in the ideal situation. Every year, you have the right to ask for an increase through your vote. And that's a good place to be in, because it means you can, without a lot of effort in terms of campaigning, be out there growing the budget at a steady rate. Even if you inherited a chronically underfunded library, you're steadily building forward, hopefully in a healthy way. Our association libraries have a very different life. They are faced with a really onerous process in many cases to get onto the ballot. So I wanted to, again, tell many of you that you might already know this, but our #1 legislative priority in the Mid-Hudson library system is to get the number of signatures for a 414 petition reduced. It's obviously unfair, and we've been making our case all legislative session on that. We have 2 sponsors willing to carry forth a bill in the next legislative session to help reduce the number. How low will it go? We can't say at this point. It's going to be very dependent on some Senate analysts who are not buying my story of how many signatures it should be, but we are not giving up on this one, because I think that would be the biggest game changer for association libraries, if we can make it easier for you to get on the ballot and give voters the chance to answer that question for themselves. I don't think the issue should be whether or not you're allowed to be on the ballot, but again, going back to democracy and letting voters make the decision for themselves. So that being said, when we talk about multi-year financial planning, you're going to come up with some numbers sometimes that are unreachable in one go. So you're not going to be able to ask for a 50% increase in many cases. Has it been done? It has. We have some amazing stories of libraries who have achieved massive increases at that level. In this current economic climate, is that going to be possible? You have to be pretty special probably to make that happen, right? So we're encouraging more libraries to think about creating more bite-sized chunks of increases. So not only are you doing multi-year financial planning for your projections of what it's going to cost to run your library at a sustainable level, but also taking a look at how you might chunk out the percentages of increase you're asking for over time. So maybe you recognize, well, hey, if we could probably pass maybe a 10% increase, and then the next year if we could get a 5% increase, and then maybe we can level off and start getting to the kind of increase that, you know, looks more like the property tax cap, which is what voters are hoping to see on a regular basis. So maybe going kind of big for a few votes, but then leveling off and getting to a place that's more sustainable over time would be a really smart strategy. Some libraries, like I said, they do it all at once, and some make it and some don't, and that's always a really painful and hard thing. But you might be in a position where just the steady small increases are just actually pushing you off the cliff over time because you're starting in a hole. So recognizing that through the multi-year financial planning activity is something that, again, gives you that reality check to do campaign strategy. As I mentioned earlier in the evening, campaign strategy, sometimes when you get down to the wire and you have to make a decision about how much you're going to ask taxpayers for, it really comes down to what do you think you can sell. There's the one side of the equation, which is what you need, and then there's what can you sell, what can you justify, and those might be 3 different answers. And so the more data you have, the better decisions you can make as you move forward. And it's hard to make those decisions unless you are doing some of this work. Many of you will rely on numbers that your director gives you, which is totally acceptable as long as you've given your director some parameters to work in for the estimates that they give you. Your director might think what you want is the cheapest possible library, and they work night and day to make it really, really cheap. They're reusing things, which is exactly, we do want them to be cost conscientious. We want them to be environmentally conscientious, but they might not realize that you really want to see a staff that's well paid, or you might really want to see a building that's really well cared for. And so what are those internal goals you're trying to achieve? So your director understands where you want to see emphasis when it comes to how those estimates are designed. So while I think this could be a board activity, it could also be a joint activity with your director, and larger libraries, you're probably having the staff do this work for you. So the new resource that is available to us all is the Public Library District Toolkit. This is available through the New York State Library's website, and it's something that there was an older version of available for many years. This is a resource that I grew up on, I like to say, in my career. I studied this thing inside and out, And it's been the result of, I will actually say at this point, millions of dollars for libraries in our system. Without this resource, I don't know that we would have libraries in the financial position that they are today. So in my mind, it's a very critical resource. So it's wonderful that it's been updated. I was privileged to work on the project with the state library and the co-author of the trustee handbook. But I just want to let you know, this has been going on for 22 years. The Board of Regents stated in the year 2000 that the best way for libraries to be funded is through public directed funding. And the number one way to do that is by forming library districts, which many of our libraries in the system have done, but as I said, half have not. So obviously still a lot of work to be done in this area. We saw the regions double down on this at the most recent plan that they did, which you see the 2020 vision. So here we are 20 years later talking about the same thing because there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. But what good work it is when library boards invest the time to do work in this area, whether it be regular 414 votes or transitioning to a district library or merging with another library that's nearby them to make a stronger unit. All of these things are game changers. They're legacy builders for a library board. And you can see that we interviewed a lot of the library trustees in New York State for this project who have been involved in these efforts over time. And you can hear not only the pride in their voice when they talk about the work that they did, but also the relief that the work they put into it resulted in a stronger financial future for their library, a lot less work at the end of the day for library boards moving forward, and that sense of security that the library is going to be around for a long time and people after you are going to help take care of it. That's a very good feeling at the end of the day. So I would say that this next slide, I hope it doesn't like make your eyes go wonky, but the New York State Library Charter Service Area maps are a real mess. You're looking at both our system here at Mid-Hudson and a peer of mine in the Southern Tier Library System. We did a presentation recently and took a look at our maps and did some thinking about how messy they are. We've got libraries of all different types, all different shapes and sizes, all different boundaries. We've got libraries overlapping each other. We've got towns with no libraries that are paying nothing. There's a lot of little crazy things going on in these maps. And so the district toolkit is designed to help solve some of the problems we see on the map and also solve problems you might be having locally with funding. So for those of you unfamiliar with some of the jargon that gets used when we talk about the sustainable funding mechanisms for libraries, this might harken back to your trustee essential days and learning about the basics of library funding. But this is a little chart I put together just to summarize the options, basically. And again, you're going to get this slide in your follow-up email after the webinar, so you'll have it as a reference point. This is not something I put into the toolkit. I guess I probably should have now that I think about it. When you take a look at your options as a library, so if you're already a district library, you're probably in a pretty good spot, and most of this might not apply to you. But there's a new piece of legislation that was just passed in the legislature. It's awaiting to be called up by the governor for signature, that is going to require a report to be issued by the Department of Taxation and Finance to report on any area in the state where a taxpayer pays for more than one library. And I know we have some folks on the call today who are in this situation where you might have 2 libraries in one town and both have their own 414 vote. So people are paying for 2 full libraries in their town. Or you might have a library that's located in a school district, and we've got a couple of these where there's 4 or 5 libraries in one school district and they all went on the ballot at some time. So people are paying for some portion of 5 different libraries. So when we think about fixing some of those situations, even the district libraries, the public district libraries in our system may want to explore some different options moving forward to undo double taxation situations, which I think we can all admit are usually pretty unfair. There's always the case for talking about the fact that both libraries are pretty underfunded. So even paying for 2, they're getting a bargain. That's not necessarily the best talking point either, because now you've got library services that are compromised by underfunding, but we don't want that to be a barrier moving forward. So understanding these options, I think, is very important for all libraries of all types, trustees of all types of libraries. Your 414 votes, most association libraries in our system at this point use that mechanism. It's based on town boundaries usually. It allows all town taxpayers to contribute to a library by virtue of a public vote. They decide how much to tax themselves for library services. The 259 vote is done along school district boundaries. Some association libraries use this. It's actually very rare in our system because of the long history of libraries it created in this area of the state. There's usually a high saturation level of libraries in any one school district. If there was only one library in a school district, it probably already is a school district public library. But hey, if you're in a situation, I know there's at least one in our system, where you're the only library in a school district, it would be really smart to convert to a school district public library and have an automatic vote mechanism every year, have public election of trustees to make sure you've got taxation with representation, and have access to capital bonding for major construction projects, which is a gift that keeps on giving. Special district libraries, they are drawn along lines that are different than school districts. It's when you cannot claim one school district, but you could carve out a district based on other municipal boundaries. You can even use fire district boundaries if you needed to, but it would mean everyone in that district is paying for library services, gets to vote on the budget, gets to vote on the trustees, and you have access to municipal bonding for capital projects. So when we think about sustainable funding, it's not just for operations, it's also for capital expenditures. So that's why the district model is recommended by New York State as the ideal model for libraries, because it provides that consistency in vote access. The taxation with representation issue is answered by having trustees that are elected by the public, and you have access to capital bonding for big projects. For those folks like Meg who have been through massive capital campaigns, those things can take a decade or more to get done. And so most boards would, maybe like a quicker path to fixing major issues with their facilities. So a lot of what I've summarized on the next few slides are things we've already talked about, but I just wanted to have it, you to have it in writing. So you've got the case that we made for a lot of the stuff we just talked about. But transitioning to district libraries or routine votes, it can address that chronic underfunding that we've talked about at length here today. It creates opportunities if you've got unserved areas neighboring your library, but people in those unserved areas use your library. It's okay up to a point, but eventually you've got folks in one town that has no library benefiting from your library, and the taxpayers of your town are underwriting their library usage. While there's always that neighborly vibe, there is a tipping point where you could make the case that too many people from one town are benefiting from the taxpayers in your town. So course correcting that and just making sure it's fair and equitable to the taxpayers of the area that are using your library. To course correct that sometimes will take one of the mechanisms that we just talked about. Shared services is such a critical talking point. The Mid-Hudson Library System, on average, is saving member libraries money on a return on investment schedule of 1 to 10. So for every dollar invested at Mid-Hudson, your constituents are getting $10 worth of services. That's a really smart talking point to use when you're talking to local taxpayers, to help them know that by working together with all the libraries in the region, you keep costs down for local taxpayers. You can also use that talking point on smaller units. You can talk about maybe you've got a couple of neighboring libraries geographically near you, and if you're partnering and doing good work together, sharing staff, doing programs together. The great example, I'm just thrilled with the libraries in Columbia County have been doing an amazing job, sharing online programs, working together at community events, creating a real, I think, profile raising project by a shared museum pass program countywide. Just doing an awesome job of leveraging county money like we leverage state money to the best possible advantage of residents. So when you're able to talk about that in an authentic way and really help taxpayers understand, you've thought of everything. You found all the cost savings, you've been looking for partnerships, you get a high return on investment in other areas of the work you're doing, so that the amount that you're actually coming to them and asking for is truly the least you could ask them for to meet the needs of the community and to be a good steward of that institution. That should build confidence for trustees that you're going in the right direction and asking folks for an amount that's reasonable and justifiable. And I am going to say it out loud. I know some of you don't want to hear it, but the importance of publicly elected trustees, I think, is going to become a bigger deal. Association libraries have gotten away for a very long time with 414 votes without being elected by the public. I can see there's some movement at the state level. Some of the questions were being asked, for example, to advocate for the retirement bill for association libraries. We've been asked for an assessment of how many of our association library boards are publicly elected. And I waited as long as I could. I didn't want to answer the question because I only have one association library in the whole system who has publicly elected trustees. And so access to things like the state retirement system, the state may say, well, to get that, you're going to have publicly elected trustees. And that one library that we have that has publicly elected trustees as an association library, they did so because their 414 vote was threatened by a group that said they would not vote yes unless the board was publicly elected. Not an unreasonable request. So something just to have on your radar. If you think it's going to be challenging for you in the future to pass budget votes, it could be something that helps more people feel confident about the future of the library. It comes with its own complications, absolutely, but it's a strategic move, I think, for some libraries in our system. Tax efficiencies, we just talked about removing double taxation. If you're grabbing some of those unserved areas and spreading out the tax burden, it can reduce taxes for some in the area, but I think also create more equitable situations in our region. I'd love to see our system chartered services map have no red zones on it, where everyone in the Hudson Valley was helping to contribute towards library service because they get to access all libraries in the system. It's only fair that all help to underwrite the cost of those services across the valley. So at the end of the day, right, what we're talking about is future-proofing the funding and governance of your library. And we talked about how you leave the library in a better spot than when you came on the board. This is exactly the work we're hoping you're interested in doing, is to really think about the financial future of the library and making sure you're responding to community needs today, but also thinking how to prepare for community needs in the future. And that may mean stabilizing the budget today, but also having a strategic way to grow the library's budget over time so it's reasonable and it doesn't require those really large asks that are very hard to get voter approval for in many cases. I think that will get harder and harder as the years go on. And when I think back to some of the campaigns I worked on in the years 2001, 2002, we saw magnificent increases, literally 50, 75, 100% increases for library budgets because they were so poorly funded. And we could get away with that because they were so poorly funded. But who defines what poorly funded is? You need to control that narrative over time and how you tell stories about the funding of your library. So I do encourage you on a regular basis through your annual report to the community, your newsletter, presentations you make at the town board, to provide people with context so they really understand what you're dealing with, whether it be chronic underfunding or the pressures of the digital ebook market or the extreme cost of broadband in some areas of the system. Those are realities that we're trying to confront and as a community solve. And so inviting folks to help you solve those problems, I think, is part of that strategy to bolster the financial future of your library. So the last thing I wanted to point out to you in the toolkit is something that my colleague Jerry laughed at me because I made a very big deal about this. And it was I felt my crowning achievement in the toolkit. We inherited the toolkit when it came out close to 20 years ago, saying that adequate public funding for a library would be if 60% of its revenues were covered by the public funding. And I always really struggled with that because that meant 40% of your funding has to be fundraised for, grants written for. It's a lot of work. And it really was detracting away from actually providing library service, trying to find an extra 40% of your budget. So the state library has upwardly adjusted that number and admitted that the bulk of your funding should be coming from that public vote, that secure and stable source. And okay, so 10% you've got to find at the end of the day. That's not too bad. But I think getting closer to 90% should be one of our major goals here. But 90% of what? We want to make sure we're actually calculating that on the realities of what we need and what our community needs so that we are doing both sides of that work moving forward in the financial planning for our libraries. So if nothing else, that will be my legacy to the library community, that we admitted that we are no different than schools and towns and other tax supported entities that are there for the public good, that public tax dollars should be supporting these entities to a very large degree so they're not in question in the future, that it's not reliant on a bake sale or finding a trustee who's amazing at organizing or fundraising, that we really want to have a secure future for an organization that's as important as the public library in our community. So I just want to say thank you for being here and the work you do on your boards to think about this stuff. It's not easy, but it's necessary. So thank you. I hope some of the stuff you heard here tonight was useful to you. And we definitely have some more time if you've got questions or comments. And Mark, I wanted to ask if we got to the question you were hoping we would about the double taxation issue.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to know if there's anything that's, libraries who are impacted by this study, if there's anything that we can do at the moment, like in a PR approach, or obviously joining up with the brother and sister library within our municipality to at least start talking. I presume that would be the next step.
I think there's two fronts of this right now from what I learned on the New York Library Association's legislative committee call yesterday. I see there is advocacy work necessary. Letters should be written to the governor. There's still this step of the governor signing the bill or not. A very similar bill was vetoed actually by Governor Mario Cuomo many years ago. And they vetoed it based on feeling it was an unfunded mandate for the departments that were asked to create the report. So of course that could be a tactic we use, but I think another tactic to use in speaking with the governor about this bill is that it's really strangely written, but it also doesn't provide for solutions. So they're going to call out libraries that have double taxation in their service area, but up until recently, the pathway to correct that has been shut off by the lack of approval of special district libraries. So I'm hoping we can help the new governor raise awareness that she should be saying yes to special districts if they're going to do something like this to us. They should also say yes in general. But I think locally, Mark, you're on the exact right path. It's coordinating with the other library in your area that's causing the double taxation situation and getting really solid talking points about why that situation exists. The fact is voters approved your situation. So making sure that's very clear and benchmarking the total amount the taxpayers in the double taxed area are paying for both libraries compared to other areas of the system where the amount might actually be comparable to what folks are paying for one library. So I think there's a variety of ways to be prepared for any pushback that could come should that report ever materialize. But I also think that that conversation about partnerships is important. How well are the two libraries working together to demonstrate that you share resources? Are there talking points that might be helpful in that area? And also revisiting conversations, and I know this is not popular, about mergers. Why haven't the two libraries merged? Does it make sense? Should we revisit that and look at it? And I know that's a third rail of conversation sometimes between libraries, but it is a viable path forward to solve that problem ultimately.
Right. Yeah, good. Thank you, Rebecca. That's helpful.
This is Meg again with a question. Of course, we're very pleased to have our 414s in all three towns approved last year.
Congratulations.
And were approved by such good margins that we were thinking, well, maybe we could go out again in 2 years, because of course we are so below that 90%. But given inflation, et cetera, is there thinking at this point about how do we go out in 2 years, or are we going to have to delay?
I would say don't delay, and in the interim, be talking all the time about how much money you save the average homeowner. That Real People, Real Dollars campaign, there's never been a better time for it as people are tightening their belts. When they're thinking about dropping their, HBO Max subscription, but they can still get streaming media from the library. Maybe it's not the newest release in the moment it comes out, but it still provides an entertainment pathway for a family that might be struggling financially. Talking about how much people are saving by coming to programs, using the library's collection, all sorts of things libraries do today help save households lots and lots of money. So if we're telling that story now, the next time we go out and ask for more, even if times are tight or hard for people, they understand that if we all chip into this resource, we can help more of our neighbors have a good quality of life in our community because we all helped out to fund the library.
Good. Okay. Got to be using those newsletters.
Yeah, we saw a lot of libraries pull back during the pandemic, right? We were so respectful of the uncertainty of what was happening on the economic front in 2020, even 2021. But the truth is, other entities that are tax supported didn't slow down at all. They went even harder on their increases they asked for. So I think that, you know, having the self-respect of the value of libraries and what we bring to the table in our communities, we should not be shy. We should be respectful, but not shy about making it known that more investment is necessary, even in tough times.
Yeah. Okay.
But you got to do it like 3 times over for 3 different votes in 3 different towns. So
Yeah, it's, in a sense, doing all 3 at once, of course, simplifies it in a way.
yeah,
But it's, just that much more complicated because we have to convince 3 different groups of people.
yeah, that's a tough one. You guys are amazing, but you do the impossible all the time, from the building you built, the campaign you ran, to winning all 3 of those votes. So I have every faith in you.
Yes, well, our gala is next Saturday. We have our fingers crossed.
Great.
I have a quick question, Rebecca. I'm a new trustee, so forgive me if this is naive or covered elsewhere. You may not even have enough time to answer, but maybe you could point me to a resource. You showed the table about the 414 and the 259 and the school district model, and I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit more about what it might look like to change from a 414 to a school district model? What's this procedure for doing that?
Yeah, the procedure is surprisingly simple. So as a 414 library, you're an association library. This would require a charter change with the state to become a school district public library. It requires a vote of the people that live within the school district to create the district, fund the district, and elect the first board of trustees of the library. So there's an initiating vote. So there would be, I would think, a fair amount of time put into a campaign to tell people why you'd be converting to that model. But then that public vote, once it takes place, allows for the charter change at the state level. And they dissolve the former association library, create the new school district public library, and thereafter you have an annual vote on your budget, trustee elections, and again, have the right to bond for capital projects.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. And so that's the exact kind of thing that's outlined in the toolkit. So the
Okay.
how-to for all of these things you can find in the state library's new toolkit.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right, Kirsten, we've hit 7 p.m. Have I missed anything? All right. All right, great. Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here. So many familiar faces here, and you've been working at it for a long time. I appreciate the time and energy you're still putting in to thinking about the future of your library. And as always, we're here to help out if you've got questions or something that we said something didn't make sense, or you want to dive into something deeper that we did here today. We're here to help out. Don't hesitate to reach out. So as always, thank you so much for all you do.